Welcome to Historic Holiday Kitchen. My name is Andrea Wilhelm and I am a historic interpreter at the Littleton Museum specializing in food history. This is episode 1 of a 3-part series where we will be exploring historic cooking practices behind modern holiday traditions from 2 time periods, 1860s to 1890s. In this episode, we will explore the history of the fruitcake while we bake 2 plum puddings, one boiled in the 1860s cabin and one baked in the 1890s house. Plum pudding was a traditional Christmastide dish brought to the Americas by the English settlers. Through the years, American cooks have transformed this dish into our modern fruitcake. Please join me now as I go to the 1860s and prepare a boiled plum pudding. Welcome to the 1860s cabin, where I'll be making a boiled plum pudding adapted from the 1864 Godey's Lady's Book. This one we first start with breadcrumbs. Every plum pudding and most puddings start with breadcrumbs. That's what makes it unique. And then we add a little bit of flour as it helps bind it a little bit. And I like to stir each one in kind of individually. And next we add the spices. The spices for 1860s will be cinnamon, mace, ginger, and clove, or any other warm spices that you would like. I also kind of add them to taste as well. And then next is the brown sugar. And we'll add the brown sugar in. And you can also add brown sugar to your taste. And if you'd like, which I do, to use my hands and get in there, kind of break it all up. Alright, next, you see it kind of looks all evenly in there, is we add the fat. Now with the plum pudding and a lot of puddings, you either add butter or this one is suet, beef suet. So it's beef fat, that is ground in and chopped fine. And we mix that in. We want that really incorporated into the batter. That way, as it melts, it will incorporate the whole entire pudding. Alright, and then we add what makes it unique and what makes it a plum pudding is our raisins. This is chopped raisins, and we'll add that in. 1860s, you could buy it stoned or unstoned, depending on how much you're willing to spend. And I like to incorporate that as best you can. It is sticky, but once the flour and the breadcrumbs get to it, kind of breaks up a little bit. Now, plum pudding is plums are English for raisins. So you need plenty of raisins in your plum pudding. Now next, next we'll add the sweetmeats. Sweetmeats are, we have orange rind, candied orange rind, candied lemon rind, and candied citron. This one is a mock candied citron that we made from our 1860s melons that we grew in our garden this summer. And that was very common in 1860. Real citron was hard to come by since it's a subtropical plant. Just incorporate that. Now the last, I will add currants. Now these currants are not the store-bought currants you get. These are the store-bought currants you usually get, and these are just raisins that are called currants. So you don't want these. you want actual currants, black currants. We had to buy these online. That's the real thing. I have soaked them in brandy, so they kind of plump up a little bit, but don't worry, they will also plump up and while you're cooking it. Now I am going to add, oops, mix that up. So now that that had a little bit of liquid in it, it's going to start to stick together. So now we just add a little bit of brandy for the flavor. If you're temperance, you would not add the brandy. And then we have milk. And you add the milk till it all sticks together. That is your, you can also use your hands. The breadcrumbs soak up that milk. This pudding, the name of this pudding is Plum pudding with or without eggs. And the recipe specifies if you have to put in eggs, then you can put in 6 eggs. I am not going to put in eggs. It is quite fine without eggs, which is also what the recipe says. Actually, that's looking pretty good. See, it's hard now. It gets pretty stiff. You want to make sure all of the breadcrumbs are incorporated into it. And then you can see it starts to, as the breadcrumbs absorbs the milk, kind of starts to stick together. And that is when you can put it into your buttered bowl. Oop, it's right here. Okay, here's my buttered bowl. See, it's nicely buttered. Now there are 2 ways to do a plum pudding. In 1860s, you could either use your mother's or grandmother's method and put it into a bag, and then you boil the bag. Or you can use a bowl and put it into a bowl and boil the bowl. It helps steam the pudding without getting it wet. So we'll put the dough in our bowl. This is enough to make probably 2 puddings. The original recipe was enough to make 4 puddings of this size. So you had enough pudding to share. And you want to pack it into your bowl very firmly. You want to add a little bit of room for expansion, so you don't want to go all the way to the top of your bowl. That's pretty good, pretty evenly, it's very evenly put in there. Now, we have our cloth. I have wet the cloth in the warm water, and that'll help it from not sticking. And this cloth, let's try it doubled and see if it works. I can't remember. Oh yes, we'll double that. It's ideal if you don't get water into it in the pudding, but sometimes that happens. Then a little bit of fabric to tie that up. I like to double it so it doesn't slip. And you want it pretty tight since you are boiling it and putting in the water. Alright, and then I leave it long so you can fish it out. And now it's ready for the pot. Alright, now we're going to put the plum pudding into our copper kettle. We have water that's boiling over the fire. I'm going to drop it right in. I'm going to do it slowly because I don't want my bowl to crack. Sinking to the bottom. Okay. Now we'll just put it back over the fire, and we need to make sure that the water stays boiling for no less than 4 hours. It needs to boil a long time. So while we're waiting for this to boil, we'll go to Cory in the 1890s house and see how she's making plum pudding in 1890s.
By the 1890s, there was a lot of variations of plum pudding in American cookbooks. For example, they would have butter instead of suet, or they would bake or steam the pudding instead of boiling it like Andrea did in the 1860s. Today I'm going to be making a variation that's much more cake-like. It's based off of a pound cake recipe, and it will be baked in a tin. To do that, I'll start with my butter, and I'll add sugar to it, and I'll cream the two together. This allows my butter to become much more light and fluffy as the sugar crystals cut through the butter. I have whipped up my butter and my sugar. As you can see, it's all nice and fluffy now. I will next add eggs. So I have one egg already cracked. Crack another one. In there. And then beat this to a nice froth. Put that in with my sugar and my butter. And then I have flour. Into that I will add baking soda. Mix that up. And then I'll add my seasonings as well. So I have salt, cinnamon, and nutmeg. And I'll add that to there. I won't add all of this nutmeg because I got too much. There we go. Mix this up. And because this follows a pound cake recipe, I have the same amount of flour, sugar, and butter. Whoops, making a mess. And then I will add my raisins. And as Andrea discussed, the raisins is what makes this plummy. And in order for this to come out of my tin easily, it's very stiff dough. It's almost like a cookie dough. To bake my cake or my pudding, I am putting it in a fancy pudding or cake mold. These types of molds were very popular in the late Victorian era. Victorians loved ornate pretty, beautiful things. And their food was no different. So they actually enjoyed baking puddings and jellies in this type of tin, and then they take it out and hopefully we'll have a beautiful cake or pudding at the end of this. So I've well greased this with butter, and I'll put my dough in a little bit at a time. And we don't want this to be too wet because it'll, we want it to be able to come out at the end when it's done baking. Press it into those corners. And then I'll cover this and put it into the oven. So I have covered my pudding or cake with a wet cloth and then tied it up with a string. And now I'll put it into my oven. It'll be 350 for about 2 hours. And I'll just let that bake.
Welcome back, and we have finished our plum pudding. I took it out of the boiling water and I let it sit overnight. Now, traditionally, you would pour brandy over it and soak maybe on a cloth and then soak it in brandy for maybe even up to a year. We don't want to wait that long, so we're gonna try it now. I have poured brandy over it and it's kind of sitting in some brandy. They would have lit it aflame as a spectacular moment on Holidays Eve. Sometimes they would even hide trinkets inside the pudding. You see all the fruit there. And if you got a certain type of trinket, it would signify like who is to be married next, or who is to have the next child, or maybe even what gender your next child is going to be. This is this is a plum pudding brandy sauce. It's brandy, brown sugar, and butter. That tastes like the holidays. So thank you for joining me in the 1860s cabin with the boiled plum pudding. Now you head back over to Cory in the 1890s house and we'll see how her plum pudding turned out.
I took my plum pudding or cake out of the oven, and then I took it out of the pudding mold or the cake mold right when it was hot so that it didn't stick to the mold. And then I made just a very simple sauce for it and poured it over the top. Now, traditionally, as you saw with Andrea, you would use an alcoholic, a brandy-based sauce. However, the temperance movement was very big in the late 19th century, and people were moving away from adding alcohol to foods and things like that. So if you happen to be in a temperate family, that would be a big no-no. So I chose something that was non-alcoholic as a nod to those people. So let's see how it tastes. big slice there. Let's give this a taste. That's a very good flavor. It's very, definitely taste the seasonings coming through. So even though it's cooked very differently, it definitely tastes like a plum pudding to me. So I'll give this a shot.
Our modern day examples of fruitcake are baked cakes with fruits and nuts. In our society that no longer favors calorie-dense cakes, fruitcake has fallen out of popularity and has become the center of many holiday jokes. I encourage you to find an appealing recipe and make this a new family tradition. You can find recipes on our website and join us for episode 2 of Historic Holidays.